I'll find them. Just stay here.
Be careful, please.
Jeb Colton never planned to buy a human being at the Broken Spur livestock auction. But when he saw the weasel-faced man dragging a mute girl toward the block like a broken heifer, something inside him snapped like a dry twig. The auctioneer called for bids on one damaged girl, sound enough for labor, can't speak nor write beyond a scribble, and the gathered crowd laughed or turned away because nobody wanted useless baggage. She stood on the block with a faded calico dress hanging loose on her thin frame, her brown hair matted, her eyes fixed on the dirt as if she'd been trained never to look anyone in the face. Jeb was a lonely rancher who'd lost his wife to fever 3 winters past, and he'd only come to town for grain, but the cruelty of the scene made his stomach churn and his fists clench. The bidding stalled at $1, a bid placed by a saloon keeper who wanted a scullery maid he could work to death, and the girl's shoulders began to shake with a silent, invisible terror. Jeb heard his own voice ring out, rough as gravel. $3, and a shocked murmur rippled through the onlookers as if he'd just thrown good money into a deep, empty well. The weasel-faced man who introduced himself as the girl's uncle snatched the coins eagerly and shoved her forward with a curse, saying, "She ain't spoke since her ma died, and she's more trouble than she's worth." Jeb caught her before she stumbled, his hands gentle on her bony elbows, and for one fleeting second she lifted her eyes to his eyes, dull as tarnished copper, but holding the faintest spark of shock that a stranger had caught her instead of letting her fall. He led her to his wagon without a word, helped her onto the seat, and draped his own coat over her trembling shoulders because the autumn wind was biting, and she felt cold as riverstone under his touch. The ride to his mountain ranch was silent except for the creak of wheels and the distant lowing of cattle, but Jeb talked to her anyway, telling her about the cabin, the creek, and the old dog named Buck who would likely lick her face the moment they arrived. She didn't respond, but he noticed her fingers relax their death grip on her tattered carpet bag, and when Buck did indeed bound up to greet her with a wagging tail, the ghost of a smile flickered at the corner of her chapped lips. He gave her the small bedroom that had once been his wife's, apologizing for the dust and the faded quilt, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment, her hand resting on the frame as if she couldn't believe a room with a real bed was meant for her. Jeb left a slate and a piece of chalk on the kitchen table, remembering the uncle's words that she could scribble, and the next morning he found a single word written in a shaky, childish hand: thank. He corrected her gently by adding a U at the end and drawing a smiling face, and when she saw it, her cheeks flushed pink and she ducked her head, but he could have sworn he heard the faintest exhale of breath that was almost a laugh. Days passed in quiet companionship. He would work the cattle and mend fences while she learned to cook, her clumsy attempts at biscuits and stew improving each day until he declared her cornbread the finest in the territory. She communicated by pointing, nodding, and occasionally writing short words on the slate: cold, horse, stars, and Jeb found himself looking forward to each new scribble as if it were a letter from a faraway friend. He never pushed her to speak, never asked about her past, and when nightmares shook her awake with silent screams that strangled in her throat, he would sit outside her door and hum old trail songs until her breathing steadied. One evening, a traveling peddler came through and offered him a small music box, and Jeb bought it on impulse and wound it up at supper, watching her eyes grow wide as saucers while the tinny melody filled the cabin like liquid magic. She pointed at the music box and then at her heart, and Jeb understood that she was telling him the sound had touched something deep inside her that words could not reach, and he nodded and said, "Music speaks when we can't, doesn't it?" That night, she wrote a new word on the slate, safe, and underlined it 3 times, and Jeb had to turn away to hide the moisture gathering in his eyes because he'd never been given a gift so humbling in all his born days. Winter descended with a ferocity that locked the ranch in snow and ice, and Jeb spent his days chopping wood and caring for the animals while she kept the hearth, blazing, and learned to knit a lumpy scarf that she presented to him with nervous pride. He wore that scarf every single day, even indoors, until she laughed silently and shook her head at his foolishness. And the sight of her laughing, truly laughing, her shoulders shaking and eyes crinkling, made him feel like a king on a throne of pine logs. They fell into a rhythm that felt as old and natural as the mountains themselves. He would read aloud from a worn copy of Shakespeare in the evenings, and she would listen with her chin propped on her hands, her eyes drinking in every word. One night, during a particularly fierce blizzard, and Jeb had to go out into the screaming wind to repair the damage before the animals froze. She tugged at his sleeve, her eyes wide with fear, and he patted her hand and said, "I'll be back before you know it." Little Bird, the nickname he'd given her because she was small and quiet and had learned to trust his open palm. He was gone for over an hour, and when he finally stumbled back through the door with ice crusted in his beard and a gash on his forehead from a falling limb, she rushed to him with a cry that was entirely silent but no less anguished. She cleaned his wound with shaking hands, her slate forgotten, and when she pressed a cloth to his brow, her lips moved as if forming words that still refused to come, and a tear slipped down her cheek and dropped onto his shirt. "Hey now," he murmured, catching her hand. "It's just a scratch, Little Bird. I've had worse from a cranky mule, so don't you fret none." But she shook her head fiercely, her whole body trembling with the effort of unsaid things. After the storm passed, he found a new inscription on the slate, "Scared," and beneath it, in smaller letters, "For you." And Jeb realized that she'd been afraid not for herself but for him, and that realization rearranged something fundamental in his chest. Spring thaw brought a visitor to the ranch, a hard-eyed man who claimed to be her uncle's business partner and demanded she be. Returned because the original sale had been improperly conducted, and he wanted her back for a richer deal. Jeb stood in his doorway with his rifle cradled in his arms and told the man that the girl was under his protection and that if he didn't ride out within 10 seconds, he'd be leaving with a belly full of buckshot. The man cursed and spat, but ultimately spurred his horse away. And when Jeb turned around, he saw her standing in the cabin doorway, her slate clutched to her chest, on which she had written a single, massive word, "Stay." "You're staying," he said firmly, "as long as you want, and nobody's taking you anywhere against your will. Not ever again while I've got breath in my body." And she ran to him and buried her face in his chest, her shoulders heaving with silent sobs. That summer, he taught her to ride a gentle Mari named Daisy, and she took to it with a natural grace, but suggested she might have ridden before her world collapsed, and they spent long afternoons exploring the high meadows together. She grew stronger and less gaunt, her hair shining with health and her eyes losing that tarnished dullness until they sparkled like sunlit copper, and sometimes he caught her humming wordless melodies that rose and fell like wind through the pines. One golden evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset bleed crimson over the peaks, she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he felt her take a deep breath as if steeling herself for something monumental. She pointed at him, then at her heart, then at the setting sun, and he understood that she was telling him he was her light, her warmth, her guiding star, and he swallowed hard and said, "You're my sunrise, Little Bird." The moment hung between them like a jewel, and she opened her mouth with an expression of intense concentration, her throat working visibly as she fought against the invisible chains that had bound her voice for so many years. Nothing came out but a strangled breath, and she slumped in defeat, tears spilling freely. But Jeb took her hands and said, "It doesn't matter if you never speak a single word, because I hear you clearer than I've ever heard anyone." Autumn painted the aspens gold and the air grew crisp, and Jeb decided to take her into town for the Harvest Festival, their first public outing together. And she dressed in a new blue dress he'd secretly ordered from the catalog and looked more beautiful than a mountain sunrise. The townsfolk stared and whispered, some of them remembering the mute girl who'd been sold for $3. But Jeb held her hand proudly and dared anyone to say a cruel word with his eyes alone. They danced a clumsy waltz on the wooden platform while a fiddler played a reel, and though her steps were unsteady, her face glowed with a joy so radiant that even the gossips fell silent and reconsidered their judgments. As they rode home under a canopy of stars, she rested against his back and traced a single word onto his shoulder with her finger. Happy. And Jeb felt his heart swell until it seemed too big for his ribs to contain. Winter returned, and with it came a night that Jeb would remember for the rest of his life. A night when a wounded mountain lion, desperate and starving, slunk down from the high peaks and cornered buck near the woodpile. Jeb grabbed his rifle and ran outside in his shirt sleeves, the cold knifing through him, and he saw the cougar's yellow eyes gleaming in the lantern light as it crouched to spring at his beloved old dog. He raised the rifle, but his fingers were numb and the shot went wide, and the cougar turned on him with a scream of fury, its powerful muscles bunching for the killing lunge that would end him in seconds. And then, cutting through the frozen air like a blade of pure light, a woman's voice, raw and cracking from disuse, but unmistakably clear, screamed one word that stopped the beast and the world and time itself. Jebb. The cougar hesitated, startled by the sound, and that half-second was all Jeb needed to chamber another round and fire true, dropping the beast into the blood-stained snow before it could complete its leap. He spun around, and there she stood in the cabin doorway, her chest heaving, her face streaked with tears, her lips still parted around the echo of his name, the very first word she had spoken in over 7 years of silence. Jeb, she said again, softer this time, testing the sound as if it were a precious thing she had just unearthed from deep beneath the frozen ground. And then she collapsed to her knees in the snow, sobbing with the relief of release. He rushed to her, dropping the rifle, and gathered her into his arms while Buck whined and licked both their faces, and he kept repeating her name. Lily, Lily, my Lily, because that was the name she had written on her slate months ago when he'd asked what her mother called her. Jeb, she whispered against his chest. Jeb, 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 as if the word were a prayer she had been holding inside her soul for all the years of her silence, waiting for a man worthy of its first utterance. I've got you, he choked out, tears freezing on his cheeks. I've got you, Lily, and you just spoke my name, and I swear I'll spend the rest of my life being worthy of that sound, so help me God. They stayed like that in the snow, the dead cougar forgotten. Buck pressed against them, and Lily talked through the night in halting, rusty sentences, telling him about the day her mother died, the uncle who hit her whenever she cried, and how her voice had simply disappeared because the world had given her nothing worth speaking to. She told him that the music box had been the first crack in the wall, that his humming during her nightmares had widened the breach, and that his promise to protect her from the man who came to reclaim her had nearly shattered the silence entirely. But tonight, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, when I saw that beast about to take you from me, I couldn't let you go without hearing me say your name at least once, because you're the only person who ever made me want to speak. Jeb kissed her then, right there in the snow with the stars wheeling overhead and the scent of pine and blood in the air, and she kissed him back with a passion that 7 years of silence had banked like a hidden fire. They were married the following spring, under the same aspens that had witnessed their first sunset together, and the preacher declared them husband and wife, while Buck served as ring-bearer with a ribbon tied around his collar. Lily's voice grew stronger every day, and soon she was talking and laughing and even singing along with the music box in a sweet, clear alto that made Jeb stop whatever he was doing just to listen and marvel at the miracle of it. She told him she wanted to name their first child Hope, because hope was the thing he had given her when she had none. And when their daughter was born the following winter, Jeb wept openly and held her tiny hand with a gentleness that belied his rough rancher's frame. Word of Lily's first spoken words spread across the territory, and women who had been silenced by fear or sorrow began writing to her, asking how she had found the courage to reclaim her voice after so many years of darkness. She always answered the same way. I found a man who listened to my silence until it felt safe enough to become sound. And when I finally spoke, the first word I said was his name, because that was the only word that ever really mattered. They grew old on that ranch, their love deepening with each passing season, and Lily never tired of saying Jeb's name in the morning when she woke, in the evening when he came in from the fields, and in the quiet moments when she just wanted to feel the shape of her salvation on her tongue. Jeb, for his part, never forgot the sound of her voice shattering the frozen night to save his life, and he told their grandchildren the story so many times that they could recite it by heart, right down to the cougar's scream and Lily's cry. When Jeb passed at the age of 82, Lily knelt by his grave and whispered, "Jeb, Jeb," one last time, and those who heard it said the wind itself seemed to pause and listen to the most beautiful eulogy ever spoken. She lived another 6 years, the beloved grandmother of a dozen little ones who never knew a day of silence from her. And when she joined Jeb in eternity, her headstone bore a simple inscription. She spoke his name first, and it was the first word of her new life. The ranch still stands, worked by their descendants who still tell the story of the lonely rancher who paid $3 for a mute girl everyone called damaged, and received a love that spoke louder than any voice ever could. So if you are waiting for your voice to return, or for someone to hear the silence you carry, remember Lily and Jeb, who proved that the quietest people often have the loudest hearts and the most to say when they finally find safety. Thank you for sharing this journey of healing and hope with us today. And if this story touched your soul, please subscribe to West Old Stories Official right now so we can continue bringing you unforgettable tales from the wild frontier. Drop a comment telling us the moment that meant the most to you. Hit that like button to celebrate the power of patience and love. And share this video with someone who needs to know that their voice, whenever it comes, is worth waiting for.